Hello again everybody, and further to my introduction to Hadrian's Wall yesterday, I'm going to consider some of the other things about the wall. So what was there on the wall, which wasn't the wall, which was part of its design? It seems from archaeology that it was a pretty fluid kind of project. It was riven with design problems and implied cost overruns, lack of clarity about its real purpose. And in this, it sounds like many large building projects, both ancient and modern, including things like Trump's Wall, HS2 Rail, and many other tyrants' vanity projects around the world. The only stated purpose from literature that we have for Hadrian's Wall is a later writer who said that it was to separate Romans and barbarians. And it might be that that is actually a statement of what the purpose might have been in the 3rd and certainly the 4th century, rather than when it was actually built in the 2nd century. Certainly it's not a barrier. It was never going to be a barrier. It was always possible to go round it at either end, and it also had gates built into it, so it's not meant to be a permanent barrier. There were also forts which were occupied by Roman soldiers north of the wall, so it wasn't a permanent this far and no further when it was originally built. It might have become that later, but probably not part of its original purpose. Initially there were no troops living actually on the wall, but that fairly soon changed. It must have been obvious to anybody, any officers who were in charge of anything on the wall, that it's no good having your troops stationed at least 3 or 4 miles away, because they've got an hour's march to get to the wall before they actually do any work of patrolling. So although forts weren't initially part of it, it seems that pretty soon they became part of it. There are different designs of forts. There are some, such as those at Bird Oswald, which jut north of the fort and have 3 exit gates north of the wall, perhaps allowing rapid deployment of soldiers if the need arose. There are others, such as Housesteads and Great Chesters, which just have one central gate, and the north wall of the fort is actually part of the wall itself. There are some cavalry forts which suggest that the auxiliaries who were the cavalry also needed to be available to be deployed perhaps north of the wall. Some had bathhouses, such as Chester's, and there's one fort which is near the wall but not quite part of it. That's the one at Carvorum, which is just south of the Walham, the great ditch, perhaps marking the sort of military zone around the wall. There were a lot of soldiers on the wall, with not much to do other than patrol and sleep and eat. It must have been a very dull and cold and miserable existence. There were some places, some forts just south of the wall, and settlements such as places such as Vindolanda, where it's obviously the case that troops went for some rest and recuperation. And there are a number of buildings in the settlement, the civilian settlement near the fort at Vindolanda, which suggests that wine, women and song and gambling were very much part of the soldier's life. We also know a bit about religious life on the wall, because there's at least one temple of Mithras next to a fortress at Caraborough. Mithras worship became very popular late second century, certainly all through the 3rd century, and we know that it was very popular with the army. So perhaps religious observance formed part of a soldier's everyday activities. Now we know quite a bit about design problems from archaeology. There are different dimensions of wall, with starting out with one with a foundation so wide and then being narrower, perhaps because of shortage of stone. We know that some of it was built of turf and timber and later replaced with stone. There were problems with geography in the central section because it's pretty hilly, and there's one famous iconic section at a place called Sycamore Gap. There was marshy ground in places, but there was there were great problems with stone near the surface, and so they couldn't dig the Walham in certain places. According to the ancient historian Peter Solway, there were really great problems with costs. Platorius Nepos was the governor under whom construction started, and he was a personal appointee of Hadrian. But at some point he seems to have fallen out with Hadrian, and Solway suggests it may well have been over the cost. Maybe it was because he questioned Hadrian's design of the wall, and Hadrian then had him removed. Hadrian certainly had form in this in other building projects with which he was associated. It's also true that Hadrian seems not to have been terribly concerned about cost on other projects with which he was involved, like his giant villa at Tivoli in Italy, or the extravagant buildings to commemorate his lover Antinous when he died in Egypt. Whatever the problems, cost, engineering, clarity of purpose, it did actually get built, and it had a lasting impact, though a somewhat checkered history. It wasn't continuously occupied. And later on, of course, it became an informal quarry, and many of the buildings of stone farmhouses of Northumberland were made out of Hadrian's Wall. Makes one wonder about modern building projects, big engineering projects, whether they will have the same impact. Will HS2 ever actually be built? Will Donald Trump's wall ever actually be completed? And if so, what will it look like? Will either of those or any other modern big building projects ever really have the same lasting impact as Hadrian's Wall did?